Ukraine was on a roll, then a clash over war strategy exploded into view. That's the headline that many of us heard last week, and it's the story I want to unpack here. For months, Ukraine had seemed to be at the edge of turning the war in its favor. Soldiers on the front line were making gains, engineers were rolling out drone attack capabilities that were hitting Russian troops from the air, and the country was securing Heimlich victories in the Black and Azov seas. In the political sphere, the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, had allowed a relatively stable relationship with his generals and a sense of patriotic unity to permeate the nation. The narrative was simple: a determined Ukraine, backing enough weapons from the West, beating the Russian army at every turn. That image began to crack when the country's youngest, most popular defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, was dismissed by Zelensky. Fedorov had been a herald of innovation, a proponent of drone warfare, the man who had breathed new life into Ukraine's fighting strategy. He was the face of diplomatic peaks such as the European Union's €90 billion loan that was pouring into the country. He had also been there when the former US President, Donald Trump, talked publicly of supplying more interceptor missiles to help Ukraine defend its skies. Ukraine was not only fighting for territory, it was betting on modern technology to compensate for numbers. Yet, in the middle of this march, Zelensky sacked Fedorov, and Fedorov refused to stay silent. The former minister took to an underground parking garage in Kiev, the only safe place from Russian missiles, to host a press conference. That setting, grim and secretive, became the stage for what he called the most dramatic, public critique the country had seen since the oral of the war. He spoke bluntly about corruption imagination in defense contracting. He revealed fractures in Ukraine's own military command structure, framing them as obstacles to innovation and speed. In his words, the generals had become a rigid bureaucracy that was jealous of new talent. If you succeed, you become a star, and then you hit a dead end, Fedorov said, pointing to how another generation of skilled leaders was being smothered by the older establishment. In other words, he accused the army's leadership of slowing down Ukraine's very modern strategy. This was not the first time Zelensky had broken with a commander. Earlier in 2024, he anchied a former commanding general, Valery Zaluzny, after a dispute over mobilization policies. Yet, reading this new coup story, it feels as if the country is at risk of fraying its own unity, a unity that had carried it through the darkest winter of the conflict. The clash between Fedorov and the generals is a clash that can animate ties not only within the military but also between the civilian leadership and the final front line. The war is now moving less on the battlefield and more into a kind of political cat-and-mouse game, where the previous narrative of a Russia-facing Ukraine that's pulling through on technology and leadership has to face the question: how does Ukraine keep old world appetitives from choking the new surge? The stakes are higher than at any other time in its history because the outcome will not just decide a war, but also determine the nature of its future democratic, civil society. The world has watched Ukraine perform under fire, and many are glad that the country has a dedicated ally like President Zelensky at the helm. Yet he must now assure the nation that this internal rift will not derail the country's crucial win-the-day initiatives. In closing, I hope that Ukraine remains resilient, that the country can address its modern strategy while shaking these political wounds, and that it can fully harness the advanced battlefield tools that it now has to defend itself over the coming months. Thank you for listening, and we'll keep you updated as this story unfolds.